By the time December 7th passes, most people think the Medicare decision is over. They assume the file is closed, the forms are done, the cards are coming in the mail, and January 1st will simply turn the key and let the machine run. I have spent most of my life watching people make that kind of mistake. They confuse the end of a decision window with the end of the decision itself. Those are not the same thing in investing. The consequences begin after the paper is signed. In retirement, it is often the same. A person picks a plan during the fall, breathes out, and tells himself the job is finished. Then January arrives, deductibles reset. Drug tiers move. A doctor disappears from the network. A specialist now needs prior authorization. The out-of-pocket maximum goes back to zero and starts climbing again. The first bills show up, and that is when the real emotion enters the room. That is when calm decisions often turn into expensive reactions. I have always believed that if you want to understand risk, you do not study the moment when people feel confident. You study the moment when they feel surprised. Surprise is where weak preparation gets exposed. A great many people are not upset in January because something illegal happened. They are upset because timing, structure, and healthcare rules collided with assumptions they never tested in advance. And that is what this whole subject is really about. It is not merely about whether March 31st matters. It does matter. But the deeper issue is that Medicare is built on timing. And timing in Medicare is tied to something even more important than timing in markets. It is tied to health. That changes the whole equation. When health is on your side, you imagine every future door will remain open. When health changes, you discover that some doors were only open for a season. I want to say that plainly because too many people hear the technical rule and miss the economic reality. The technical rule may say you are allowed to make a change. The economic reality may say that the change you really want has become harder, more expensive, or impossible to secure. That gap between what is theoretically allowed and what is practically available is where retirees get hurt. So let me walk through this the way I would think about any major long-term commitment. First, I would figure out what the current window actually allows. Then I would separate normal annual noise from a real structural problem. Then I would ask what optionality I am giving up if I wait too long. Then I would ask what happens if my health is not the same 10 years from now as it is today. And finally, I would stop treating this as a one-year purchase and start treating it as a long runway decision. That is the only way to think clearly. The first fact is simple. The January through March 31st Medicare Advantage open enrollment period is not for everybody. It applies to people who are already enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan as of January 1st. That point matters. If you are in Medicare Advantage on January 1st, you generally have one opportunity during that January through March period to make a change. One, not a series of experiments, not a sequence of monthly adjustments. One opportunity, you can move from one Medicare Advantage plan to another Medicare Advantage plan. You can leave Medicare Advantage and return to original Medicare. And if you are returning to original Medicare, you can add a standalone Part D drug plan. That is the practical menu. Now, let me tell you what people often hear instead. They hear that there is a window, and they assume the whole system is open again. That is not true. This is not a universal do-over. If you are in original Medicare and you suddenly decide in February that you want to jump into Medicare Advantage, that is generally not what this window is for. If you already made a change during this period, you do not get to keep changing your mind over and over. If you are hoping to drop or add drug coverage while staying inside the same overall structure, the rules are narrower than people think. And if you are imagining that returning to original Medicare automatically means you can pick up a Medigap policy with no friction, that is where the most expensive misunderstanding begins. A lot of confusion exists because the calendar gives people a false sense of freedom. The calendar says one thing, health underwriting may say another. That is why I do not like reducing this conversation to a slogan, like, yes, you can still switch. That sentence is technically attractive and practically incomplete. A better sentence is this. If you are enrolled in Medicare Advantage on January 1st, you may have one opportunity to change course before March 31st. But the quality of the path available to you depends on what kind of coverage you want next, and whether underwriting enters the picture. That is the real sentence. Now let us talk about why January feels so uncomfortable for so many people. Every year, I watch retirees interpret a reset as a mistake. Those are not the same thing either. Insurance has a rhythm. January 1st is a reset button in more ways than one. Part A, deductibles reset. Part B, deductibles reset. If you are in Medicare Advantage, the out-of-pocket maximum resets. Part D, drug deductibles reset. Drug coverage may be reorganized, tiers may shift, networks may change, benefits may look a little different from the way they felt in December. That does not automatically mean you chose badly. It may simply mean the year turned over. This distinction between a reset and a mismatch is one of the most valuable distinctions in the entire file. I want to stay with it because it is where good judgment lives. Suppose your costs jump in January. That alone does not prove you picked the wrong plan. Suppose a deductible that had already been satisfied last year is now back at zero. That feels painful, but it is normal. Suppose your prescription moved to a higher tier and costs more than it did before. That may be unpleasant, but it may still be the ordinary consequence of a plan year resetting. Suppose you suddenly notice more out-of-pocket exposure because the internal counters went back to the starting line. Again, that can be normal. But normal does not mean harmless. It means expected. The question is not whether January surprised you. The question is whether the surprise revealed a flaw in fit. That is the distinction. If your doctors are still in-network, your key prescriptions are still covered acceptably, your referrals are manageable, and your out-of-pocket structure remains reasonable for the way you use care, what you may be experiencing is frustration, not misalignment. Frustration is real, but it is not always a reason to abandon a plan. Misalignment is different. Misalignment is when the structure itself no longer fits your life. Your doctor is gone from the network. Your specialist access has become harder in a way that changes your care. Prior authorizations are standing between you and the treatment path you expect to use. Your prescription coverage changed in a way that materially alters affordability. Your travel patterns are broader than the local network structure was built to serve. You have multiple chronic conditions, and the narrower arrangement that once felt efficient now feels restrictive. That is not a mood problem. That is a design problem. And when the design is wrong, the cost is not measured only in premium dollars. It is measured in stress, friction, delay, and sometimes foregone care. I have long believed that a bad business can be cheap and still cost you a fortune. Health coverage works the same way. A plan can look economical when you are viewing it only through the lens of premium. It can become expensive when you begin paying in hassle, limited access, repeated approvals, and unstable certainty. So before anyone makes a January decision in a burst of irritation, I would slow the whole process down and ask a few sober questions. Are my important doctors still participating and actually in network, not just listed in an old memory of last year? Are my key hospitals available under the plan I am considering? Are my prescriptions covered, and if they are covered, at what tier and under what cost sharing? What is the out-of-pocket maximum now, and how does it compare with the exposure I already carry? Do I need referrals more often than I am comfortable with? How does this plan behave around prior authorizations, especially for imaging, specialists, therapy, or procedures I may realistically need? Those are not glamorous questions. They are profitable questions. By profitable, I do not mean they make you money. I mean they prevent unnecessary loss. That is the entire game in late life. Avoiding unnecessary loss matters more than chasing cosmetic savings. Now we reach the part of this subject that surprises people every year. Leaving Medicare Advantage and going back to original Medicare sounds, on the surface, like a clean move. People say to themselves, fine, I will just go back to original Medicare and add a supplement and be done with it. But the words just go back can hide a lot of trouble. Because while the program rules may let you leave Medicare Advantage, the next layer of coverage you hope to add may not come to you automatically. And that next layer matters enormously. If you want original Medicare plus a Medigap policy, you may run into medical underwriting unless you are in a protected situation or live in a state with more favorable rules. That means you may have to answer health questions. The insurance company may review your medical history. You may be denied. You may be charged more. You may discover that the plan structure you want is not available to you on the clean terms you imagined. This is why I keep returning to the idea of optionality. People often believe the key freedom is the right to leave a plan. That is not the only freedom. The more valuable freedom may be the ability to land safely somewhere else. And those are two different freedoms. You can have the first without fully possessing the second. That is where retirees can misunderstand the landscape. The limiting factor is frequently not whether you are allowed to move. The limiting factor is whether your health status and the underwriting rules allow you to complete the move in the form you actually want. I have seen investors make this same mistake in other settings. They focus on the exit door and fail to ask what price the market will offer once they reach it. In Medicare, the question is not simply, can I exit Medicare Advantage? The question is, what kind of coverage can I secure after I exit, at what cost, under what underwriting conditions, and with what permanence? That is a much better question. Now, there is one protection in this area that deserves real attention because it can materially change the answer for some people. That is the trial right. If you joined a Medicare Advantage plan when you were first eligible for Medicare, generally around age 65, and you are still within your first 12 months of that arrangement, you may have a one-time opportunity to return to original Medicare and purchase certain Medigap coverage on a guaranteed issue basis. That means no underwriting and no health questions for that protected move. That is a powerful right. And it exists for a reason. The system is, in effect, acknowledging that the first year may be a testing year. You try the structure, you learn what it feels like, and if you conclude that the fit is wrong, there may be one clean path back. But I want to emphasize the word one, and I want to emphasize the phrase first 12 months, because once that period passes, that specific protection generally fades. Then the decision becomes much more sensitive to health status, state rules, and underwriting. This is why I never treat the first Medicare decision as a small administrative choice. It is a structural decision. The person making it may feel healthy at 65 and may think, I can always revisit this later. Maybe, but maybe is not a strategy. Health changes, needs change. Tolerance for network constraints changes. Travel patterns change. Specialist use changes. What seems like a minor compromise at 65 can feel like a permanent limitation at 75 or 85, and unlike many consumer purchases, the bad news does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it arrives years later, when flexibility matters more and is available less. That is why the initial enrollment period is so important. If you are turning 65 soon, you are standing in the cleanest decision zone you are likely to have. This is the part of the process where flexibility is at its highest. The initial enrollment period lasts 7 months, 3 months before your birth month itself, and 3 months after. That window is not merely an invitation to sign up. It is the moment when your future options deserve the most serious thought. Because this is the moment when you are not only choosing coverage for this year, you are choosing the structure that may define what kind of flexibility you have later. I would urge anyone approaching that age not to ask the smallest possible question. Do not ask only, which plan is cheapest this year? That is too narrow. Ask, which structure has the best chance of fitting the next 10, 20, or even 30 years of my life? That sounds like a big question, because it is a big question. But long-term decisions deserve long-term thinking. If you enroll late, you may face penalties on Part B or Part D. If you enroll incorrectly, you can create gaps. If you jump quickly into a structure without understanding the future consequences of switching, you may mistake speed for wisdom. The clean entry point is precious. It should not be spent casually. Now, let me talk about why Medicare Advantage is attractive to many people in the first place, because fairness matters. For some retirees, it works beautifully. If you are comfortable with networks, if your care patterns are relatively straightforward, if you value lower upfront costs, if the provider setup in your area fits the way you live, a Medicare Advantage plan can be a perfectly sensible choice. The problem is not that Medicare Advantage is inherently wrong. The problem is that some people buy it for the wrong reason and with the wrong time horizon. They buy it as though they are buying only a one-year premium. They are not. They are buying into a structure, and structure becomes more important as life becomes less predictable. If you travel frequently and want broad provider flexibility across state lines, that structure may matter a great deal. If you have complex or multiple chronic conditions and want wider access to specialists, that structure may matter. If you do not want to live inside recurring referral or authorization logic for major imaging, specialist care, or procedures, that structure may matter a great deal. If you can tolerate those trade-offs and the economics favor you, fine. But if you cannot, then a low premium can become a false bargain. The best long-term decisions are rarely those that optimize only for the cheapest line item today. They optimize for durability. And durability in retirement means asking whether the plan will still feel workable when your health is not as easy as it is now. This is the point many people resist because nobody enjoys planning for decline. But reality does not ask whether a topic is pleasant. It only asks whether you prepared for it. So when I think about someone choosing coverage at 65, I do not want him to choose a plan that only fits the healthy version of himself. I want him to think about the version of himself who is older, slower, more dependent on specialists, more likely to need procedures, more likely to value simplicity, and less interested in bargaining with bureaucracy. That version deserves a vote too. Now, life does not always keep its changes inside the neat official windows, and the Medicare system recognizes that to some degree. That is where special enrollment periods come in. These are not universal escape hatches, and they are not triggered by ordinary regret, but they do matter. If you move out of your plan's service area, that can create a qualifying circumstance. These plans are built around local networks, and if you move beyond that local footprint, the coverage arrangement may no longer function as intended. If you lose employer coverage, perhaps because you or a spouse had continued working past 65, and that coverage ends, that can matter. If a plan terminates or exits your area, that matters. If you gain or lose dual eligibility for Medicaid, that matters. If you qualify for or lose the low-income subsidy for prescription drugs, that matters. These are situation specific. They do not belong to everyone. But they are important because they remind us of something essential. The Medicare calendar is not completely rigid, but most flexibility still comes from either being in the right standard enrollment window or having a genuine triggering life event. Outside of those circumstances, the world narrows, and people should understand narrowing before they experience it. Another reason the first quarter of the year feels so unsettled has nothing to do with a bad plan selection at all. Sometimes the pain arrives through premiums. This is where IRMAA enters the conversation. Income-related monthly adjustment amount sounds technical, and it is, but the emotional result is simple. A person notices that his Part B premium is higher and feels as though the ground shifted beneath him. The key detail is that IRMAA is generally based on income from 2 years earlier. That means the premium you are paying now is often tied to a financial picture that may no longer reflect your current life. This creates a kind of lag, and lag can be expensive if you do not understand it. Suppose your income has dropped because you retired, because you divorced, because a spouse died, or because work hours were significantly reduced. In circumstances like those, there may be an appeal path that matters. A great many people assume the higher premium notice is final and permanent for the year. Not necessarily. If the increase is tied to a recognized life-changing event, there may be a basis to ask for relief. This is one of those areas where ignorance costs money in silence. The money just leaves. No dramatic scene, no headline, no alarm, just a larger premium drafted month after month because nobody realized an appeal might be available. At the same time, it is important to know what does not qualify. A Roth conversion that increased income and pushed you over an IRMAA threshold is generally not the kind of life-changing event that opens the appeal door. And that, too, contains a lesson. Timing matters not only in Medicare enrollment, but also in adjacent financial decisions. You cannot separate the two completely. A tax move today can become a premium consequence later. That does not mean the tax move was wrong. It means the side effects should be known in advance. That is what adults do with serious systems. They study the second-order consequences. Now let me zoom out because clarity often comes from looking at the whole calendar instead of a single date. January 1st is the annual reset for everyone. That is when deductibles reset. Drug tiers can change, and the benefits of the new plan year take effect. If January suddenly felt different, this is usually why. January 1st through March 31st is the Medicare Advantage open enrollment period for those already enrolled in Medicare Advantage on January 1st. That is the one change window we have been discussing. March 31st is the cutoff for that particular flexibility. After that, for most people, the system becomes quieter and tighter unless a special enrollment period is triggered. Spring matters for people approaching age 65 because that is when initial enrollment begins for many upcoming birthdays. And then October 15th through December 7th is the broad annual enrollment period that most people know best. When you look at the calendar in one piece, the confusion starts to fall away. The dates are not random. They are a map of where flexibility expands and where it contracts. Every retiree should know that map. Not because the map is interesting, but because the wrong turn can remain expensive for a long time. So what do I want a person to do when he sits down in January or February and says, I am not sure this plan still fits me? I would begin with an honest audit, not a panic. An audit, I would list the doctors that matter most. Not every doctor in the world, the ones that actually matter to your life. I would verify network participation, not assume it. I would list the prescriptions that matter most and confirm how they are covered now, not how they were covered last year. I would examine the out-of-pocket maximum with open eyes. I would look carefully at referral requirements and prior authorization behavior. I would ask whether the problem is a deductible reset or a structural mismatch. Those are different remedies. A reset may call for acceptance and planning. A mismatch may call for action before March 31st. Then I would go one layer deeper. If the contemplated move is from one Medicare Advantage plan to another, I would compare the structure of the new plan with more seriousness than most people bring to the decision. Network cost sharing, drug tiers, referrals, prior authorization, provider participation. Those are not footnotes. They are the operating system. If the contemplated move is from Medicare Advantage back to original Medicare with the hope of adding Medigap, then I would immediately focus on eligibility, underwriting, and whether a trial right applies. That is a different conversation, a much more delicate one, and if the person is still in the initial Medicare year, I would treat that as a moment of unusual value, because rare flexibility should never be wasted through ignorance. Everything I have said can be compressed into a single practical principle. Do not confuse availability of change with availability of the outcome you prefer. That mistake sits at the center of a lot of Medicare disappointment. Yes, a window may exist. Yes, a rule may permit movement. But the quality of the landing zone depends on more than the rule itself. It depends on your health, your state, your underwriting situation, your timing, and the kind of structure you are trying to secure for the years ahead. This is one reason I have always admired simplicity when it is honest complexity, pretends to offer more possibilities than it really does. A wise person strips the matter down to first principles. What am I covered for now? What can I change now? What becomes harder later? What happens if my health deteriorates? What am I buying besides this year's premium? When you answer those questions, the fog begins to lift. I also want to say a word about emotion. Health coverage decisions often produce a special kind of anxiety because the stakes are intimate. A bad stock purchase can hurt your balance sheet. A bad health coverage fit can make you feel exposed. That exposure is not merely financial. It reaches into how secure you feel when you need care. That is why many people overreact in January and underprepare in advance. They spend too little time before the decision and too much emotion after the bills arrive. The better rhythm is the reverse. Do more thinking before the window closes. Do less panicking after the year begins. In my experience, the people who do best in long systems are rarely the people with the most energy. They are the people who respect structure. Medicare rewards that kind of. It rewards knowing which dates matter to you and which do not. It rewards understanding the difference between an annual reset and a flawed plan fit. It rewards people who know that the decision at 65 can echo through the next 20 years. It rewards people who understand that optionality is most valuable before you need it desperately. And it punishes casual assumptions. It punishes delay. It punishes the belief that all future choices will remain as easy as today's. So if you are in Medicare Advantage right now and January has made you uneasy, do not rush, but do not drift either. Audit the facts, study the structure. Use the one change window intelligently if the fit is truly wrong. If you are thinking of returning to original Medicare with Medigap, investigate underwriting before you act and determine whether a trial right or other protected situation applies. If a premium shock arrived through IRMAA and your income has genuinely fallen because of a recognized life change, examine whether an appeal is available. If you are approaching 65, treat the initial enrollment period as a clean slate, not a routine chore, and if your current coverage still fits and January simply reminded you that deductibles and plan years reset, do not manufacture a crisis where there is only calendar math. That may be the simplest sentence in this whole discussion. Not every painful January signal means the plan is wrong. Some of it is just the year restarting, but some of it is a warning. Wisdom lies in knowing which is which. The final thing I would leave you with is this. At 65, many people think they are choosing between products. In reality, they are often choosing between future constraints. The premium is visible. The network is partially visible. The later underwriting reality is often invisible. The cost of losing flexibility is invisible. The effect of changing health over a decade is invisible. And invisible costs are the ones people underestimate most. I have made a career out of trying not to pay invisible costs. That habit works here too. Do not buy only what looks fine in the present. Understand what the structure may feel like when the future arrives. Because Medicare, like investing, is kinder to the prepared than to the surprised. And in retirement, surprise is usually expensive.